A father repaired his security cameras, and what he saw turned his blood cold. His own son and daughter-in-law rifling through his private papers, whispering about forging documents to steal his home and shoving him into a cramped apartment. Every word dripped with greed, every laugh cut like a knife, and the betrayal from the very child he sacrificed everything for was almost too much to bear. Yet as he replayed the footage, the heartbreak hardened into something sharper. They thought they were setting the trap, but he had already begun his plan. Subscribe for more, and comment where you're watching from, because what comes next will leave you speechless. Richard sat alone in the dim glow of his study, the grain of the oak desk worn smooth by years of bills, letters, and late-night prayers. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of the old clock that had hung in the hallway since his wife was alive. He stared at the framed photo of her smiling on the lake pier. The sunlight caught in her hair, and his mind unraveled the years he had built into the life of his son. The boy had been his reason to push through endless 12-hour shifts pouring concrete in the Arizona heat. His reason to take on every overtime job when others quit, his reason to sleep in the cab of a truck more nights than he cared to count. His wife had gone too soon, the cancer eating her body, until all that was left was Richard holding their boy's hand in a sterile hospital room, promising he would carry the weight of two parents so his son would never feel the absence. He kept that promise. He never missed a school play, even if it meant dragging his mud-stained boots straight from the job site. He drove an old pickup until it coughed its last breath so he could put away enough for David's tuition. He patched roofs, painted houses, and worked weekends so his son could have things other kids took for granted. And through all those years of sacrifice, Richard believed love and loyalty were unbreakable. But the recording had shattered that illusion with a cruelty he could barely process. To hear his only son, the boy he once carried on his shoulders through county fairs, describe him as an obstacle, it was worse than any insult he had ever endured. His chest ached as if something sacred had been ripped from him. He remembered the nights David would curl against him after nightmares, whispering that he was afraid of losing him too. Richard would whisper back that he would never leave that family, was forever. And now here he was listening to that same boy plot his erasure like it was nothing more than a business transaction. The fury came slowly, like heat crawling under his skin, but it was the heartbreak that hit hardest. He thought of the long hours under steel beams, of the broken bones and stitched up cuts of the years where his own dreams collected dust while his sons were built brick by brick. Every sacrifice had been worth it, or so he had convinced himself, because David would be the man who carried the family forward. Instead, that man now sharpened knives behind his back. Richard rose from the desk, restless, his hand brushing the spines of old books, the scent of tobacco lingering in the room, though he hadn't smoked in decades. He walked into the kitchen, turned on the light, and saw the notepad where he had written grocery lists, reminders for doctor's appointments, notes for home repairs. Ordinary things, the markings of a life lived with structure and purpose. Now every mundane detail seemed to mock him. He had built order, loyalty, and steadiness, and in return his son saw only opportunity to exploit. He opened the fridge, staring at the leftovers of a pot roast he had made the night before. He had learned to cook after his wife's death, stumbling through recipes until he could replicate her Sunday dinners for David. It had been his way of keeping her alive at the table. And yet now he saw those meals for what they had become, offerings to someone who had already sold his loyalty elsewhere. His appetite vanished, leaving only the sour taste of bitterness in his mouth. That night, sleep didn't come. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, each slow turn echoing the words from the recording obstacle burden signature. He replayed every moment he might have missed, every warning sign he ignored because he wanted so desperately to believe his boy was still the child he raised. He thought about the callous laugh of Melissa, about the cool tone of Alan, the lawyer friend, as they laid out the blueprint to steal his home. He thought about David's silence, the way his son had let others speak for him as though his father was no longer even worth the courtesy of direct betrayal. By dawn, the desert sky was streaked with pink, and Richard sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee, the morning air biting at his skin. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing against him: surrender to the betrayal or confront it head on. his hands wrapped around the mug until his knuckles whitened, the warmth burning into his palms. He thought of his wife, of the promise he made to protect their son, and wondered if he had failed her by letting the boy grow into a man who could betray his own blood. Yet somewhere under the sorrow, a colder thought emerged. Maybe he hadn't failed her at all. Maybe David had simply chosen his own path, one lined with greed and manipulation. The trust was broken beyond repair, but in its place grew something sharper, something more dangerous. Richard felt it take root like steel beams set in concrete. If his son thought he was old, weak, and easy to erase, then his son had never truly known the man who raised him. He had built buildings from the ground up. He knew how to construct and how to dismantle. And just as he had spent years creating a life for his son, he could just as carefully dismantle the fragile empire David thought he was building. He finished the coffee and set the cup down with a steady hand. His mind was no longer clouded with grief. The betrayal had cut him open, but it had also clarified everything. He saw now that the boy he had raised was gone, replaced by a man whose loyalty had a price tag. And if that man thought the battle was already won, he was gravely mistaken. Richard would not confront him with rage or shouting matches. He would not give him the satisfaction of seeing him broken. He would answer betrayal with silence, patience, and precision. As the sun climbed higher, casting sharp light across the desert gravel, Richard stood straighter, his shadow stretching long against the earth. The trust was shattered, the bond severed, but in the ruin he felt something awaken. His son had underestimated him, and that was the one mistake he would never let him forget. The day moved forward, but the decision was already made. Richard had chosen his path, and every step from now on would be deliberate. The clock ticked louder in the house, the same rhythm that had guided his wife's final days and his son's childhood. It was no longer just the sound of passing time, it was a countdown. And when it struck, when the moment arrived, the boy who called him an obstacle would discover the truth. Obstacles can be moved, but foundations cannot. What Richard was about to do next would change everything, and for David and Melissa, it would be the day they realized they had underestimated the wrong man. Richard sat in the quiet of his study, the glow of the computer screen casting harsh lines across his face as he played the recording again. Each word was a blade slicing deeper, the sound of Melissa urging David to find the deed echoing through the speakers like a death knell. Her voice dripped with impatience, sharp and cutting, as if she were discussing nothing more significant than misplacing a set of car keys. But the subject was his house, his sanctuary, the walls that held the memory of his late wife, the years of sacrifice, and the laughter of a boy he once believed would never turn against him. David's voice followed lower, hesitant at first, but growing steadier as Melissa pressed him. "Alan can handle it," he said. Alan, the name rolled through Richard's head like poison. A lawyer, a so-called friend ready to forge signatures and bend the law until it snapped. Melissa's tone grew slick with greed as she spoke of a quick sale, her voice almost cheerful. $500,000 easy. We'll get rid of the old place and move him somewhere smaller. It makes sense. Richard's knuckles whitened around the edge of the desk as if gripping wood could steady the storm inside him. He could see the figures in his head, $500,000, the value of his life's work reduced to a dollar sign spoken with the detachment of a grocery list. They had stripped away the meaning of the house, the memories etched into every wall, the nights of hammering and sanding, the sweat soaked into its foundation. To them it was cash and waiting. Melissa laughed, a sound that grated against Richard's ears. "It's not like he needs all that space," she said. "He'll get used to it. People his age always do." Richard felt his hands tremble, but not from weakness. The tremor came from rage tightly contained, a fury pressed into silence, waiting for release. He imagined the smug look on her face, the way she would twist her manicured fingers around a wine glass while plotting the eviction of the very man who had built the roof over her head. David's reply was soft or uncertain, as though the last flicker of conscience tried to break through. "He might notice if it's too fast. He's not stupid." But Melissa was quick to smother the doubt, her words smooth and venomous. "He's old David. He doesn't understand half of what he signs. You said it yourself. Alan can make it clean. Once it's done, it's done. We'll be free." The word free echoed in Richard's chest like a cruel joke. Free from what? From the man who had paid for his education, from the father who had stood in the rain at every graduation, who had cheered the loudest at every small victory, free from the one person who had never turned away. No matter the cost, the betrayal sank heavier than the Arizona sun in July. And for a moment Richard felt the room tilt. He pressed his palms flat against the desk, steadying himself, his breath slow and deliberate. He could not let the anger consume him, not yet. Anger was fuel, but fuel needed direction. He rewound the recording, letting the words play again, absorbing every detail, every tone, every pause. Evidence was piling in his favor, but evidence alone would not satisfy him. He needed them to see to understand that the man they dismissed as weak was anything but. He rose from the chair and walked to the bookshelf, his eyes landing on a small metal box tucked behind dusty novels. Inside were documents he hadn't touched in years. Insurance policies, bank records, the original deed to the house, crisp and stamped, bearing his name and his late wife's. He held the paper in his hand, the weight of ink and authority reminding him of his own power. They wanted this deed. They wanted to erase him from it, but they would never imagine he still had the foresight to keep it secured in a place only he knew. Outside the window, the desert night stretched wide, the air humming with cicadas, the stars sharp against the black sky. Richard thought of the conversations around his kitchen table years ago when he and his wife would whisper about the future, about giving their son everything they could. He thought of the nights she worried whether David would grow into the man they hoped for. Richard had always defended him, then always said the boy had a good heart. Now, staring at the evidence of his betrayal, Richard could hear her voice in his memory. Sad, disappointed, but firm. "Don't let them take everything from you, Richard." He slid the deed back into the box and locked it. His life might have been reduced to numbers on a page in their eyes, but he was not a number. He was a builder, a survivor, and now a man who understood that the people closest to him could become enemies cloaked in familiar faces. He sat back down, his breath steady, the rage now cold and sharp. The plan was unfolding, yes, but not only theirs. They thought they had cornered him, but in truth they had exposed themselves. Every word they spoke was another nail in the coffin of their own undoing. Richard's trembling hands became still as stone. The man they believed fragile was awake now, watching, listening, waiting, and what he was preparing would make their scheme look like a child's game. Richard leaned closer to the screen, the glow washing his face in stark light as if the shadows of his own home had turned traitor. The voices carried clearly, every syllable sharp and unrelenting, and he heard David's idea spill out like poison in a glass of water. "We'll just tell him they're medical forms." His son said the words almost casual, almost lazy, but underlined with a malice that no father should ever hear from his child. The suggestion landed like a strike to the chest. Medical forms, words that twisted his years of trust and dignity into a tool for deception. Melissa laughed, first short and sharp, the kind of laugh that carried no warmth. "It's perfect," she said, leaning into David's confidence. "He signs anything you put in front of him. He doesn't even read half of it. He thinks everything is routine." Richard could almost see the smug tilt of her chin, the way she looked at him, as though he were already erased, as though decades of sacrifice were nothing more than fading ink on paper. Then David laughed too, and it was the sound that broke something deeper than anger in Richard. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was mockery. His own son, his flesh, his blood, was laughing at the man who had carried him on tired shoulders, who had worked until his bones ached to put food on the table. The laugh wasn't just cruel. It was dismissive, a sign that David had already buried the man who raised him, reducing him to a caricature of an old fool too forgetful to know better. They spoke about his confusion as if it were fact. Melissa called him absent-minded, David called him forgetful, and Alan, the so-called lawyer friend, whose voice slipped into the conversation, suggested they make the forms thick with fine print, so Richard would never catch on. Slip in a few pages about long-term care. Alan advised, his voice steady, professional, detached. He'll think it's all standard procedure. Nobody questions paperwork when it looks official. Richard sat back in his chair, his fingers pressed into the wood so tightly that the ridges of the desk cut into his skin. He had never felt smaller, and yet never so awake. It wasn't just the house they were trying to take from him. It was his identity, his mind, his ability to decide for himself. They weren't simply stealing property. They were attempting to strip him of the last measure of control he had left in his life. They wanted to turn him into a man defined by their lies, reduced to a signature forged in manipulation. He thought of the small indignities of aging, the occasional misplaced keys, the forgotten appointment, the stiffness in his knees when he climbed the porch steps. These were the normal battles of time, but now his son was using them as ammunition, twisting them into a weapon. To hear David suggest that his memory was failing, to hear Melissa agree so quickly, made Richard feel like they had been rehearsing this role for him for months. The humiliation burned hotter than anger. They were gambling on the assumption that he was already too far gone to defend himself, but what they didn't realize was that every insult, every laugh at his expense, was chiseling away the remnants of grief and hesitation, leaving behind something sharper, colder, unbreakable. He closed his eyes for a moment and remembered his wife. Her hand on his cheek when she told him not to let the world convince him he was lesser just because he was aging. She had been gone for years, but her voice was there now, steady in his memory. And in that moment, Richard knew he wasn't just fighting for his home. He was fighting for the dignity she believed he still carried, the strength she had always seen in him. The recording kept playing, their laughter filling the room like smoke. But Richard no longer trembled. He sat still, his breathing slow, his eyes locked on the glowing progress bar moving across the screen. They thought they were clever, that he was weak, that the best years of his life had already passed him by. They were wrong. He had built foundations that outlasted storms. He had carried weights that would have broken other men. And now he would carry this betrayal until he turned it into the one thing they never expected. They believed they were using his age as a weapon, but Richard understood something they didn't. Age wasn't a weakness. It was experience. It was patience. It was knowing how to wait until the right moment to strike. And that moment was coming faster than they could imagine. Richard stood in the kitchen with the refrigerator humming low behind him, the only sound in the dark house. His hands rested on the edge of the counter, calloused palms pressed into the cold granite, as if grounding himself against the weight of what he had just heard. The betrayal still stung, but in that silence something shifted. He had replayed the recording enough times to know their voices were unmistakable. David's laugh, Melissa's venom, Alan's professional calm, they had sealed their fate with every careless word. The footage wasn't just evidence. It was ammunition. He poured himself a glass of water, the stream hitting the glass like the steady beat of a drum. And as he lifted it to his lips, he caught his reflection in the kitchen window. The man staring back at him was older, lines etched deep across his face, gray at his temples, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. But in those same eyes there was something new, or maybe something forgotten, buried beneath years of sacrifice and grief. He didn't see a victim anymore. He saw the builder, the fighter, the man who had once carried his family on his back and refused to break. That man was still alive, and tonight he was waking up. Richard walked into the pantry and retrieved the small safe tucked behind stacks of canned goods. The combination clicked beneath his fingers with a precision that had never left him. Inside, neatly organized, were tax returns, contracts from old construction jobs, a stack of savings bonds he'd bought decades ago, and at the very back, a smaller drive he hadn't touched in years. He plugged it into his computer, transferred the recordings, and made duplicates. Every click of the mouse was deliberate, every file saved like a weapon placed carefully in an arsenal. They thought of him as a confused old man. Let them. They had no idea how many contingencies he had quietly built over a lifetime of surviving setbacks. As he worked, his mind replayed the years of discipline that had shaped him. He remembered long nights on job sites where one wrong calculation could collapse steel and ruin lives. He remembered how silence had always been his greatest strength, how listening before acting often revealed more than rash confrontation ever could. Silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy, and tonight, silence was his weapon. He sat back, the computer screen glowing in the dim room, and allowed the grief to harden into something unyielding. There would be no shouting matches, no desperate pleas to make them see reason. That was the old Richard, the father, still clinging to hope that love was stronger than greed. But that man was gone. What stood in his place was someone far more dangerous, a man who knew betrayal inside and out, who had no illusions left, who had traded sorrow for steel. He shut the safe and slid it back into place, the sound of metal on metal, final, decisive. His kitchen felt different now. Not just a room where he reheated leftovers or sat with coffee at dawn. It was a command center. The table where he had once taught David how to balance a checkbook would now serve as the place where he would dismantle the empire his son thought he was building. The pen and paper waiting there were no longer tools for grocery lists. They were instruments of war. Richard turned off the lights and walked through the house, his steps slow and measured. He touched the walls as he passed, feeling the solidity of the home he had built, every nail and beam a testament to his labor. This wasn't just property, it was legacy, and legacy was not something that could be stolen with forged signatures and mocking laughter. By the time he reached the living room, the weight in his chest had shifted. The despair was gone, replaced by clarity. The house was silent, but within him something roared. He sank into the worn leather chair that had shaped itself to his frame over decades and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes burning with a fire that hadn't been there in years. They thought they had cornered him, that his age was their advantage. But age had given him patience, foresight, and a kind of cold endurance his son and Melissa couldn't begin to fathom. He pulled out a notepad and wrote a single line across the top. They will never see it coming. His handwriting was steady, each letter carved into the paper like a vow. Beneath it, he began sketching outlines, names, connections, weaknesses. Alan had a law license to protect. Melissa had family debts she thought no one knew about. David had always needed validation, always wanted to be seen as smarter, stronger, more capable than he was. Richard saw through them all, and now he would use every flaw, every crack, every blind spot to his advantage. The night wore on, and Richard didn't sleep. He sat in that chair listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of the house, settling his mind sharper with every passing hour. The sorrow that had once clouded him was gone. In its place was resolve, pure and cold as steel. For the first time in years, Richard felt alive. Dawn would come soon, the desert sun flooding the sky with fire, but he wasn't waiting for light. He didn't need it. He already saw the path forward clear and ruthless. And when the time came to act, his son would discover what it meant to underestimate the man who had built his world with bare hands and could tear it down just as easily. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, streaking the kitchen in sharp lines of gold and shadow. Richard sat at the table he had sanded down years ago, the surface now polished smooth from decades of meals, conversations, and silent mornings. Across from him, David and Melissa placed a folder neatly in front of him. Their smiles rehearsed, their tones drenched in syrup. David's hand rested on the cover, tapping once as though unveiling some great gift. "Dad, this is all for your own good," he said softly, his voice dripping with an affection that no longer rang true. Melissa leaned in, eyes bright, nodding quickly, her manicured fingers folded together like a patient teacher, ready to guide a child through an important lesson. Richard glanced at the folder, then back at their faces, and let his mouth curve into the faintest of smiles. He leaned back in his chair, feigning the slow consideration of a man too tired to question his children. But inside, every nerve was alert, every word they spoke etched into his memory like a knife being sharpened. Melissa was the first to open the folder, sliding out a stack of papers and arranging them carefully in front of him. It's just about future security, she said, with a voice that tried to sound soothing, almost maternal, though her eyes betrayed the sharpness beneath. We want to make sure everything is handled properly, you know, in case something ever happens. These things give peace of mind. David chimed in, his tone carrying a false weight of responsibility. Exactly. This way you don't have to worry about Bill's paperwork or legal stuff down the line. We'll take care of it. You can just relax, Dad. Isn't that what you've always wanted? Richard nodded slowly, his expression carefully blank, though inside his blood ran hot. Relax. The word curled in his stomach like acid. They wanted him to hand over the key to his life so they could dismantle it while calling it a gift. He picked up the first page, squinting at the tiny print that sprawled across it. It was thick with legal jargon, the kind that wound itself in circles, designed to exhaust the reader into blind trust. Melissa reached out quickly, pointing to a section with the tip of her polished nail. You don't need to read all that, she said, her tone dismissive. It's just standard legalese. Everyone signs these kinds of forms. David laughed softly, adding, honestly, Dad, you'll get a headache trying to go through it. That's what lawyers are for. Alan already looked it over, he said. It's perfectly fine. Richard let out a chuckle of his own, deep and tired, a sound that could easily be mistaken for compliance. He laid the page back down, gently adjusting it as though aligning his trust with theirs. Alan looked it over, huh? He murmured, his tone mild, almost casual. Melissa nodded eagerly, her eyes darting to David for reassurance, clearly pleased that the conversation seemed to be drifting in their favor. Richard's hand brushed over the pen on the table. He let his fingers linger there just long enough for them to believe he might reach for it. But instead he folded his hands in his lap and leaned back again, his gaze shifting between them with the weight of a man who had lived long enough to master silence. Every word they spoke was evidence, every phrase another stone laid in the wall of their guilt. He watched their mouths move, heard their practiced tones, and saw through every layer of their performance. Melissa's smile was too wide, her eyes too restless. David's voice cracked slightly when he leaned on the word trust. They were playing a role, and Richard let them believe he was still an audience too old and tired to notice the seams of their act. Dad. David pressed gently, placing his hand on his father's arm. Think about it. You won't have to deal with property taxes, maintenance, any of that hassle anymore. We'll handle it all. You've earned the right to take it easy. Melissa nodded again, her voice soft as silk. Don't you want to enjoy your time without stress? Isn't that what Mom would have wanted for you? The mention of his wife's memory was a calculated strike, and Richard felt the sting of it sharp and deliberate. They were weaponizing her love, twisting her legacy into another lever to pry his hand open and take what was his. He let his gaze drop to the papers again, his brow furrowed in an expression that could easily be mistaken for hesitation, maybe even confusion. Melissa slid another page forward, tapping at the bottom line where his signature was meant to go. Just here, she said gently, as if coaxing a child to finish his homework. It won't take a second. Richard lifted the page, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs. He saw the word transfer buried halfway down the phrase irrevocable authority tucked beneath it. He let the silence stretch the ticking of the old wall clock, filling the room like a drumbeat. Then he smiled faintly, almost to himself, and set the page back down without comment. He picked up his coffee cup instead, taking a slow sip, the steam curling between them like a veil. The silence unsettled them. Melissa cleared her throat, glancing at David. David shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening as he tried to maintain his composure. Richard saw it, the flicker of impatience, the faint crack in the mask. He leaned back, setting the cup down with a soft clink, and said nothing. He let them sit there, their own desperation swelling in the air. He had the recordings. He had the papers in front of him. And now he had their voices, their manipulations captured not only in digital files, but in the theater of his kitchen, where they believed they still held the upper hand. Richard masked his suspicion beneath that faint smile, but inside he was already filing every word away, every gesture, every attempt to play him for a fool. The clock struck noon, the sound reverberating through the still room. Richard folded his arms across his chest, his eyes calm, unblinking, and let them believe he was considering their offer. But beneath the surface, a different kind of decision had already been made. They thought the papers were the trap, but they hadn't realized yet Richard was the one tightening the snare. And when it snapped shut, they would never forget the moment they tried to dress theft in the language of love. The clock on the wall ticked louder with every second, each stroke cutting through the stale air of the kitchen. Richard sat still, the folder of papers spread in front of him, the faint aroma of morning coffee clinging to the room. He let the silence stretch, savoring the discomfort it stirred across the table. Melissa's polished smile had started to crack at the edges, and David's fingers drummed impatiently against the tabletop. Richard didn't reach for the pen. He didn't even glance at the lines, waiting for his name. He simply breathed, his stillness deliberate, his hesitation calculated. That hesitation was gasoline on dry brush. David's face darkened, the calm veneer collapsing in an instant. His hand slammed the table, rattling the glassware. "Just sign the damn papers." The words ripped through the air, raw and unrestrained, nothing like the soft assurances he had rehearsed. The fury in his voice reverberated against the walls, a shattering of the false kindness he and Melissa had cloaked themselves in. For the first time, Richard saw his son stripped bare. Gone was the smile, gone was the gentle tone. What remained was desperation, ugly, unpolished, undeniable. Richard's eyes locked on David's, and the room seemed to narrow to just the two of them. His son's mask had fallen, and in its place was something Richard had feared but never wanted to name: greed, naked and hungry. The boy he had once carried on his shoulders, the young man he had once trusted with his heart, now stood before him as a predator snarling at his prey. But Richard didn't flinch. He felt something shift deep in his chest, something that had been dormant too long. The betrayal still stung, but this explosion didn't weaken him. It lit a fire. Melissa's voice tried to smooth over the jagged edges of the moment, her tone sharp with forced calm. "David, please don't raise your voice. He's just confused." But her eyes betrayed her, darting nervously toward Richard, checking to see if the mask could be forced back on. Richard said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was power. David mistook that silence for resistance, and his anger surged. His face flushed, red veins tightening at his temples. "Do you think this is optional?" he hissed. "Do you think you can just sit there and drag this out? We're trying to make this easy for you." His words came too fast, tumbling over themselves, desperation bleeding into every syllable. Richard had heard that tone before, not in his son, but in men cornered on construction sites, workers cutting corners exposed at the wrong moment. It was the sound of someone realizing their control was slipping. Richard's courage rose, steady and deliberate. The old fear that had clung to him the night before dissolved under the heat of David's outburst. He saw clearly now. His hesitation had peeled back the curtain, exposing the rot beneath. No more pretending, no more manipulation dressed as kindness. David's explosion was proof of everything Richard already knew but needed to see. His son was no longer his son. He was a thief, desperate and clumsy, and he had just shown his hand. Melissa reached across the table, touching David's arm, her whisper sharp as glass. "Stop. You're making it worse." But it was already too late. The words had been spoken, the mask had shattered, and there was no putting it back together. Richard felt an odd calm settle over him, a clarity that washed away the weight of grief. His heart no longer ached with the same sorrow. Instead, it beat with something steadier resolve. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his voice low but cutting. "That's the real you," he said softly, his gaze fixed on his son. No smiles, no sweet words. Just this: greed, desperation. David's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. Melissa's hand froze on his arm. Richard let the silence hang heavy, his words sinking into the air like iron. For the first time, He didn't feel like the cornered man. He was the one holding the reins. The room was still except for the sound of the clock ticking louder now, marking the seconds like a judge's gavel. Richard sat back again, calm and unhurried, the faintest of smiles touching his lips. His sorrow was gone. His fear was gone. In its place was the iron resolve of a man who had carried too much for too long and had finally found the strength to fight back. And in that silence, with his son's mask lying broken between them, Richard knew the game had changed. The courage he felt wasn't fleeting, it was permanent. The tide had turned, and the boy who thought he held the upper hand had just shown how fragile his grip truly was. What Richard would do next would not just defend his home. It would dismantle everything David and Melissa thought they had built piece by piece until all that was left was the memory of the day they mistook silence for weakness. The silence after David's outburst stretched long, brittle, and heavy. The air in the kitchen clung thick, charged with the heat of everything unsaid. Richard's eyes were steady, colder than the steel beams he'd once set into the bones of buildings. He let the tension ripen, let it choke the room until neither David nor Melissa dared fill it with their syrupy lies. Then, with the patience of a man who had carried burdens most of his life, he leaned forward, voice measured and sharp as a blade. "I know," he said. The words landed like gunfire. David blinked his anger, faltering confusion breaking through his bravado. Melissa's smile twitched, the corners trembling as if she were scrambling to hold together the mask that had already cracked wide open. Richard didn't flinch. He reached across the table, tapped the stack of papers with a single finger, and said, "Every word, every plan, every laugh at my expense. It's all on tape." David's mouth opened, then closed again. Melissa found her voice first, her tone slicing into the air with mockery. "Tape." She laughed, a short, sharp sound designed to belittle. "You're imagining things, Richard. You're paranoid. No one's conspiring against you. You're just tired. You don't understand what's good for you anymore." Her voice oozed with pity, but her eyes betrayed her darting sideways toward David with the faintest flicker of panic. Richard leaned back, folded his arms, and studied her like a specimen pinned under glass. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Paranoid?" His voice was low, steady, almost calm. "Then maybe you can explain why I have hours of footage of you two and Alan scheming in my living room. Maybe you can explain your voice, Melissa, talking about selling this house like it was already yours. Or David's voice saying I'm an obstacle. Or Alan suggesting medical forms to trick me. You want to call that paranoia? Go ahead. But when the police hear it, they'll call it fraud." The color drained from David's face, leaving behind something pale and sickly. His fists tightened, but he couldn't meet his father's gaze. Melissa sneered, doubling down, her laugh brittle. "Recordings can be faked. Anyone can splice audio together these days. You think anyone's going to believe a lonely old man over us? We're family, Richard. Who's going to take your side when everyone knows your memory is slipping?" Richard's hands rested on the table, steady, unshaken. He leaned in, eyes narrowing, his words precise. "I'm old," he said, each syllable a nail hammered into wood. "But I'm not an idiot." The room vibrated with the weight of it. His voice cut through their denials, leaving no room for retreat. For years they had counted on his silence, his patience, his willingness to believe the best in the people he loved. But that man was gone. What sat across from them now was something unyielding. David shifted his jaw tight, words fumbling at his lips. "Dad, you're twisting things. You don't get it. This is for your future. For your safety. You shouldn't be alone in a big house. We're just trying to protect you." His voice cracked at the edges, desperation bleeding through. Richard's eyes burned, not with tears but with something colder. "Protect me," he repeated softly. "By stealing what I built. By laughing at me when you think I can't hear. By calling me weak. That's not protection, David. That's betrayal." His voice sharpened and his son flinched like a child caught in a lie. Melissa tried again, leaning forward, her tone syrupy. poisonous. Richard, you're remembering things wrong. Maybe you misunderstood what you heard. Stress can play tricks on the mind, you know. We only want what's best. But Richard cut her off with a wave of his hand, his voice suddenly iron. Enough! The word rang out like a hammer striking steel. I've built my life on knowing what's real, on measuring twice and cutting once. My mind doesn't play tricks. Not now. Not ever. You think age makes me blind, but I see clearer now than I ever did. And I see you both for exactly what you are. The quiet that followed was suffocating. Melissa's smirk faltered, her lips tightening as her eyes darted once more to David. He looked down, his knuckles white where his fists pressed against his thighs. Richard watched them crumble, and for the first time in days he felt the weight shift. They were the ones cornered now. He rose from his chair slowly, deliberately, letting the scrape of wood against tile grind into their ears. He stood tall, shoulders squared, casting a long shadow across the table. You wanted me to sign my life away, but it's already too late for that. The only thing sealed here is your fate, and the more you speak, the deeper you bury yourselves. Melissa forced out a laugh, weak and thin, her confidence fraying. You wouldn't dare take this anywhere. You'd embarrass yourself. But her voice shook, betraying the fear behind her bravado. Richard leaned down, his face inches from hers, his words slow, deliberate. Embarrass myself? No. I'll embarrass you. I'll destroy the perfect little image you've built. The world will hear your voices before they ever doubt mine. He straightened his hand, brushing the folder of papers off the table. They scattered across the floor, a blizzard of lies, and neither David nor Melissa dared move to gather them. Richard's heart beat steady, strong, no longer burdened by grief. He was done being the man they thought they could corner. He had the truth, he had the recordings, and he had the will. And now, with the first strike delivered, Richard knew the war had only just begun. The papers still lay scattered across the kitchen floor when David leaned forward, his voice sharp, his desperation clawing through every word. You're going to sign them, Dad. You don't have a choice. His hands trembled as he gathered the scattered pages, slapping them back onto the table with a force meant to intimidate. Melissa's eyes were wide. Her confidence rattled, but not yet gone. Her lips curled into a sneer that tried to mask the panic creeping into her voice. Richard, stop this nonsense. You're embarrassing yourself. Just sign and end this. But Richard didn't move. He stood there in the silence, the faint hum of the refrigerator underscoring the weight of the moment. His gaze was steady, unshaken, and when he finally opened his mouth, it wasn't to argue, it was to end the game. The front door opened. The sound was soft, almost ordinary, but in the thick tension of the kitchen it cracked through the air like thunder. Heavy footsteps followed, deliberate and echoing against the hardwood floor. David's head snapped toward the sound, confusion flashing across his face, while Melissa's eyes darted sharp with sudden dread. Into the kitchen stepped three figures, a detective in a dark suit, a lawyer with a leather briefcase, and two uniformed officers. Their presence shifted the air, filling the room with a quiet authority that silenced everything else. Richard didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device, setting it on the table with calm precision. The hidden microphone clicked as he stopped the recording, its tiny light blinking before going dark. Proof, Richard said evenly, his voice slicing through the room. Every word, every threat, every laugh, all of it. The detective stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his presence carried weight. He placed a folder on the table beside the microphone. We've reviewed the recordings, he said flatly, and we've verified the footage from the security cameras. It's all there. His eyes shifted from David to Melissa, cold and steady. Fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse. Do you want me to keep going? David's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came. He looked at Melissa, his mask of confidence shattered, but she was already unraveling, her breath sharp and uneven. This is a setup, she stammered, her voice rising an octave too high. He's manipulating all of this. He's old, confused. You can't take him seriously. Richard leaned forward, his hands resting firmly on the table, his voice unshaken. "I told you," he said, his words measured like a verdict. "I'm old, but I'm not an idiot." The lawyer stepped closer, his briefcase snapping open as he pulled out documents. "The deed is still in Richard's name," he said calmly, his tone final. "There is no transfer, no authorization, no legal standing for anything you've tried to fabricate. What you attempted is not only invalid, it's criminal." Melissa's composure collapsed. She reached for David's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve, her voice breaking into a panicked whisper. "Say something. Fix this." But David couldn't. His lips moved soundlessly, his breath shallow, his chest rising and falling like a man drowning. The officers stepped forward, their shadows stretching across the floor, and the metallic snap of handcuffs echoed like the toll of a bell. Melissa turned feral, her mask gone completely, her face twisted with rage. "You think this changes anything?" she spat at Richard, her voice venomous, sharp. "You've destroyed your own family. You'll die alone in this house, and when you do, no one will even remember your name." Richard's expression didn't flicker. He watched as the officers took her by the arm, her words unraveling into incoherent fury. David, pale and trembling, allowed himself to be cuffed, his head bowed shoulders, slumped, the weight of his choices finally pressing him into submission. The sound of the door closing behind them was not thunderous. It was quiet, deliberate, like the final page of a long and bitter chapter turning. The detective paused at the doorway, his gaze meeting Richard's for a moment. "You did the right thing," he said. His tone carried no pity, only respect. Richard gave a small nod, nothing more. He didn't need validation. He already knew. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that pressed deep into the bones, but this time it wasn't heavy. Richard picked up the microphone, turning it over once in his hand before tucking it back into his pocket. He gathered the scattered papers and slid them into the trash, each crumpled page landing with a finality that resonated through the still air. He walked to the window, the late afternoon sun spilling across the room in sheets of amber light. Outside, the street was quiet, the world unchanged, and yet everything inside him felt different. He had faced the worst betrayal a father could endure and turned it into his own weapon. The grief had not vanished, but it had hardened into something unbreakable. His hands were steady now as he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, the steam rising into the air. He sat down at the table once more, the same place where his son had tried to strip him of his dignity. But now the table was his again, the house was his again, and the silence belonged to him. He lifted the cup, his reflection glinting in the dark surface of the liquid, and for the first time in years his lips curved into something close to a smile. The war was over, but the reckoning was not finished. There were still debts to settle, truths to reveal, and a legacy to reclaim. And Richard, steady and unyielding, was only just beginning. David's voice cracked as the cold steel closed around his wrists, his body twisting toward his father in one last desperate plea. "Dad!" He gasped, his words frantic, his eyes wide with panic. "I'm your son. Are you really destroying your family for a house?" His tone carried the weight of false innocence, the final weapon of a man cornered, hoping that blood alone could undo the ruin he had caused. Richard stood tall in the fading light of the kitchen, his shadow stretching long across the floor. His gaze didn't waver, his face carved in stone. For a moment silence hung heavy, as though the walls themselves were waiting to hear his verdict. Then his voice came steady, sharp, and unflinching. "No son," he said, the words slicing through the room like steel. "You destroyed this family the moment you decided my life was worth only the money from my home." The sentence landed like a hammer. David's mouth opened, but no reply came. The words stripped him bare, leaving only the shell of a man exposed before his own guilt. Melissa tried to turn her head away, but the officers held her firm, her sneer collapsing into a mask of rage and fear. The air seemed to shift, the balance of power no longer in their hands but firmly in Richard's. The officers led them out, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. The sound of the front door closing behind them carried a finality, a sharp punctuation mark on the end of years of sacrifice, grief, and betrayal. The house fell quiet again, the kind of silence Richard had once dreaded but now welcomed. It was no longer emptiness. It was peace. He looked around the kitchen at the scattered remnants of the confrontation, the overturned chair, the papers crumpled in the trash, the faint impressions of hands slammed into the table. This was his battlefield, and he had walked away not just unbroken but stronger. He exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest lifting, replaced with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. His dignity was intact. His home was safe, and his story was no longer one of a man cornered by age and betrayal. It was the story of resilience, of a father who refused to be erased. Richard poured himself another cup of coffee, the simple ritual steadying his hands. The steam rose into the air, curling in the dim light, and he took a slow sip. The bitterness no longer tasted like despair. It tasted like survival. He carried the mug into the living room, settling into the old leather chair that had borne his weight through grief, through nights of loneliness, through years of silence. This time it felt different. The chair no longer held the burden of sorrow. It held the calm of victory. On the mantel above him sat the photograph of his wife, her smile forever frozen in the glow of a summer sunset. Richard looked at her, and for the first time in a long while he didn't feel the sharp sting of loss. Instead, he felt her presence like a steady hand on his shoulder, reminding him that he had done what was necessary, that he had defended not just his home, but the dignity of the life they had built together. The night deepened outside, the desert sky lit with stars so sharp they looked carved into the black. Richard leaned back, his eyes heavy, but his spirit awake. The silence in the house was no longer a reminder of what he had lost. It was a canvas for what remained, for the truth that he had survived and endured. His son's betrayal had cut deep, but it had also revealed something David could never erase: the strength of a man who had built everything with his own hands, who could weather storms and still stand. As the clock ticked steadily on the wall, Richard closed his eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in rest. He no longer feared what tomorrow might bring. The war was over, and he had emerged with more than just his home. He had reclaimed his voice, his power, and the certainty that his story would never again be written by anyone but him. And somewhere in the stillness of the night, as the house stood solid around him, Richard knew this wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one built not on weakness or betrayal, but on the quiet, unshakable strength of a man who had faced the fire and refused to burn. Life has a way of testing us sometimes through the people we least expect, our own family. Richard's story is a reminder that trust once broken cannot be easily repaired, and that silence is not always weakness. For older adults, the lesson runs deep. Never underestimate the value of protecting your independence, your dignity, and your legacy. Age does not strip away wisdom. It sharpens it. It teaches us to see through false kindness, to recognize manipulation, and to stand firm even when others try to make us doubt our own strength. Richard's calm resolve shows that resilience is not about shouting the loudest, but about knowing when and how to act with precision. The home he defended became more than brick and wood. It symbolized his life's work, his memories, and his worth. For anyone facing betrayal, his story urges us to remember that we are never powerless. Our voices, our choices, and our courage matter. Hold on to your dignity. Trust your instincts, and never allow anyone to write the final chapter of your life without your consent. If this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters too.